And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, to another episode of All of the Above, the show that gives you an unstandardized take on education. I'm Jeffrey Garrett, one of your co-hosts, along with
Manuel, your favorite teacher's favorite teacher. And if you're catching this on YouTube, please remember to subscribe. If you're watching us on Facebook, please remember to like our page and share this with your friends. And if you're listening to the audio-only podcast, thank you for tuning in. But do know I am wearing a lovely powder blue tie that was a gift from my in-laws, and it's very special to me. And you're missing out on that. But thank you for tuning in.
All right, now we are excited to have you back, and we've got another great episode for you today featuring three very special guests. One, a middle school teacher in South Los Angeles who's using technology to accelerate learning in her classroom. One, a professional in the tech industry who helps schools access new tools for learning. And the third, a professor who specializes in critical media literacy. With their expertise, we'll be exploring questions about the use of technology in the classroom. What role should technology play in learning? Is the influx of devices into the classroom transforming learning? And how do we teach students to responsibly navigate learning and living in an online world? But first, we dive into some headlines in education in a segment we call The Warm-Up. In recent years, many of the nation's largest school districts have seen massive drops in suspension rates for students. This is great news. But is school discipline reform going too fast? This is the question explored in a recent piece in The Atlantic. Following years of advocacy from community groups, from parents, educators, and guidance issued by the Obama administration back in 2014, many districts began tackling the thorny issues of huge suspension rates and massively disproportionate rates for Black and brown students. As a result, many schools and districts have taken on restorative justice practices in an effort to create healthier school cultures and an environment that helps students who've committed a violation restore their place in the school community. And it would seem to be working. Los Angeles has seen suspension rates fall from 9% to 1% over the last decade. New York City, the nation's largest district, saw a 46% decline in just 5 years of changed policies. But many teachers and advocacy groups say that improving numbers hide the real truth. In most districts, training for teachers in restorative practices has been limited, and the staff and resources provided to schools to implement the policies are typically inadequate at best. Some teacher groups are even claiming that these policies are the main driver for teacher turnover in districts who have adopted them. Manuel, as a teacher, what's your take? Is the move towards restorative justice practices a good thing, or is this really just moving numbers around and hiding the truth?
Well, in general, I think it's a good thing by far, but I have heard it said that restorative justice practices presume that there was justice there to begin with. And we know that a lot of discipline challenges are rooted in some of the trauma and some of the struggle that students are bringing to the classroom from their lived experience outside of school. So these practices are a good step towards trying to deal with discipline in such a way that students are kept in school and embraced and supported and helped through their challenges. But there is also something to be said about the decline in suspension rates and how much to really buy into that, because discipline rates, suspension rates, like graduation rates, it's pretty easy to cook those books, and schools do it. And the argument that some teachers are being maybe pushed out of the classroom or deciding to leave the classroom because they're so frustrated with discipline procedures at their school site, I don't buy that. There might be some teachers that are frustrated, but I would argue that most of those teachers probably are frustrated with so-called classroom management in general. And restorative justice practices, I don't think should be blamed for any of that. But I do think it's the right direction to go. We're not there yet. It's not perfect, but we're making some progress.
Yeah, I agree. Well-intentioned policies that should continue. I think the operative meaning we have to pull out of it is that restorative justice and restorative practices are about restoring something that needed to already exist.
Right.
You have to have a healthy culture in order to restore a healthy culture. I think sometimes the policies miss that step and don't put in place resources and the things that schools need to really create and build healthy cultures, especially for some of our kids who are getting into trouble the most.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right, so now for our next story. In an article in The Atlantic, Clint Smith III, known as Clint Smith III on Twitter, he explores the largely overlooked impact that the new tax plan may have on public schools. Under the Republican plan passed through Congress last December, families are now allowed to use 529 college savings plans, also known as qualified tuition plans, to pay for private K-12 schooling. This allows families to withdraw up to $10,000 annually per child from these tax-free accounts and use that to pay for private schooling. Smith argues that this new deduction creates an incentive for parents to take their children out of public schools and put them in private ones. Prior to the new Republican plan, funds from qualified tuition plans couldn't be used for private school tuition. Of course, an incentive for families to send their children to private schools means that public schools will not only lose some students, but they'll also lose some money since they rely on enrollment numbers to qualify for much of their funding. That means less money for public schools and more money for private schools. This change in 529 college savings plans, combined with the new $10,000 cap and deductions for state and local taxes that public schools rely on the most for their funding, means that the tax law would, over the next 10 years, blow a $150 billion hole in state and local revenue earmarked for K-12 schools. Jeff, why aren't more folks talking about this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the actual truth is because people don't like to get into the weeds around policy, and in the weeds is actually where most of the most important stuff actually is.
Right.
So at the end of the day, 529 plans, in theory, were really good policy to help people save for college and to incentivize that sort of saving. The fact that this is being morphed into a tax-free way for rich folks to pay for fancy prep schools is just frankly unacceptable and an embarrassment in a society where the rich already have too much and the rest of us are struggling to find resources to pay for what's basically needed at our public schools. At the end of the day, this is just one of many, many pieces inside of the new tax policy and inside of the Trump administration that are doing harm to our schools directly and indirectly.
Absolutely. And you mentioned in our previous episode some of the other aspects of the tax plan that bear a brunt of challenge towards public school funding. And, this is something that for sure, as we get to know more and more about this tax plan and how things roll out, public schools and those interested in the health and welfare and well-being of our public school system, this is something that folks are going to have to continue to look into and decide what they want to do about it.
Yeah. Yep. Next up, we turn to a story about assessment. The Learning Policy Institute released a new report in January examining the case for using performance assessment as the key measure of college readiness in place of the more traditional metrics like SAT or the ACT. Now, for you non-educators out there, performance assessment is when a student is asked to complete a task and then that task is scored on some sort of a rubric. The report outlines examples of high leverage practices already in place in some states and districts around the country. Unlike traditional assessments that critics have long argued are culturally biased or that favor certain types of learners, namely those who excel in high-stakes single-shot assessments, performance assessments can offer a more holistic picture of a student's abilities. And from an equity standpoint, proponents of the use of performance assessments argue that they give a more accurate measure of students' abilities across racial groups and across socioeconomic status. Quote, if organized in an easily reviewable form, the report notes, results from rigorous, validated, high-quality performance assessments could be used for college admissions, as well as for placement and for advising decisions, as well as for potential post-secondary assessments of likely success. So, Manuel, should this spell the end of the SAT and the ACT, or is this performance assessment talk just a fad?
Well, anything related to education today is at risk of being a fad because have been many, many fads in education. And performance assessments could be a fad, but I don't think they are just a fad. First of all, performance assessments are dope. I love them. They definitely give us classroom educators a lot more to work with in terms of assessing a student's comprehension of our learning targets. However, they're not easy to pull off, especially nationally in place of something like the SAT. The SAT isn't going anywhere. There have been challenges to the SAT over the years, and College Board has seemed to respond to each challenge with some sort of modification of the SAT or something. Like that income is not going to go anywhere. We will continue to struggle with trying to assess college readiness. I think performance assessments will help us get closer, but even those will be difficult to model closely enough to actual lived college experience to give us a real indicator of how ready a student is for college. So I think that'll be an ongoing struggle. But this isn't just a fad.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree. Performance assessments undoubtedly give us a more holistic picture of students and what they can and cannot do. I think that's pretty indisputable. But at the end of the day, it's logistically extremely difficult to think about fully replacing something like the SAT with a rigorous research paper, for example. That said, it's interesting to note that a number of the nation's most competitive colleges have been progressively de-emphasizing the importance of the SAT or the ACT in their admission criteria over the years. So maybe there's some push on both sides of this from educators K-12 who would like to see some other measures, and maybe some colleges kind of pushing downward on the system and thinking the same thing.
Oh yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if 10 years from now the SAT looks a lot more like a performance assessment than it does now. And I think when we took the SAT years ago, that version of SAT looked quite a bit different than this modern version. And like I said, that's a big moneymaker. College Board could rest easy tonight. It will always be a part of our national education discussion one way or another.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So next up, we move into a segment we like to call the show and tell.
Jeff, what have you brought to show us today?
All right, well, for today's show and tell, I brought in this book. It's a copy of Lerone Bennett Jr.'s Before the Mayflower. I brought this in to share because it was one of the core texts of the African American history class I took in high school. And it is a cornerstone of my historical and political awakening as a young man. This text, given to me in the 10th grade by a public school teacher, shout out to Mr. Mead from St. Paul Central High School, helped me understand and grapple with the history of our nation openly and honestly. Americans, unfortunately, are shockingly uninformed about our own history. We see funny episodes on talk shows where people don't know who the vice president is, and where people don't know when the War of 1812 happened. And let's be real, those are funny. But what we are seeing today in our national discourse and in our federal government is an erasure of aspects of our history and a refusal to accept some of the hard, important truths of our American past. This is a nation founded on the genocide of Native peoples. This is a nation whose wealth was derived from more than 2 centuries of slavery and another century of legalized racial terror after that. This is a nation that stole massive amounts of territory from Mexico to stretch from sea to shining sea. This is a nation that has interfered in democratic elections in dozens of countries around the world, and frankly continues to do so today. This is a nation that knew about the Holocaust, but refused to enter the war until Japan attacked our military colony in the Pacific, which we later claimed as the state of Hawaii. This is a nation whose great middle class was built with the largest and most successful social programs in our history, including the GI Bill, the FHA, and Social Security, but who denied those benefits to blacks systematically. This is a country that still today does not allow its people to directly elect the president. This is a country that actively suppresses voter turnout in its elections. This is a country that has not yet allowed women to vote for even half of its existence. And this is a country where progress on any of these issues has been resisted violently by law enforcement, by elected officials, and by the majority population. Now, I say this not to depress anyone or to simply bash America. I say this because we have failed as a society to teach our full history. We have succeeded in teaching about the great ideas of democracy and freedom in some of our founding documents. We have succeeded in teaching about our progress towards fairness and equality. We have even succeeded in teaching about the power of our military and our economic strength. But in that success, we have also succeeded in denying ourselves a full understanding of who we are, of why our society looks the way it does today. By hiding from the fullness of our past, we deny ourselves a true understanding of who we are. As a former social studies teacher, I am sad to say that schools have, to a large extent, much of the blame to bear in perpetuating this problem, particularly our schools in suburban and rural areas. How is it that in 2017, we have a growing number of people joining white nationalist terror groups? How do we have such a large percentage of the population that is so woefully uninformed about basic functions of government to the point that they proclaim things like, "Keep your government hands off my Medicare"? How do we have conservatives using the language of the civil rights movement to berate people of color who are standing up for their rights as pandering to so-called identity politics and being the true racists in our society? While there is enough blame to go around, we cannot escape the idea that our system of public schooling has failed to provide a responsible education to many of our fellow citizens. The great Martin Luther King Jr. once said that the function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. Intelligence plus character. That is the goal of true education. Well, it is clear that we are not doing a good enough job of teaching either intelligence or character. As we live through an era of regression towards a mythologized past when America was supposedly great, where alternative facts are proudly proclaimed as truth, and where hatred and bigotry are proud features of our political discourse, the importance of a strong, functioning system of public education has never been more clear. The way forward for us perhaps begins with doing a much better job of looking backwards with honesty and courage to confront what's there. That's why I brought in this book, and that's my show and tell for today.
Well, when I sat here on the show a few episodes back and said that teachers need to defend all of their students regardless of their immigration status, I got called libtard, pencil neck, and I know I'm pretty skinny, but pencil neck, that's pretty harsh.
Don't forget snowflake.
Snowflake for sure, and a bunch of other things. So I am actually eager to see what folks will have to say about that show and tell. You spoke some very powerful truths there. I wholeheartedly agree as a social science teacher that we need to not just focus on the promise and greatness of America, but also explore some of the very dark truths that helped get us here. But I don't think that everyone agrees.
Yeah, I know for a fact that not everyone agrees, and that's why I brought in this book.
But why don't you love America, though? Like, if you don't love it, you could just move.
This is available at the Pasadena City Library. I'll be returning it this evening, and you can find it there on the shelf. Before the Mayflower, from the late, great Lerone Bennett Jr.
Rest in peace.
Rest in peace, passed away on February 14th. Yeah, I think we have to do a better job of really teaching the realness, the truth of our history. Only by understanding where we have come from can we really understand who we are and where we're going next.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that show and tell. And up next, we have a seminar segment looking at technology in the classroom. When you mention the word school to most adults over the age of 30 today, a certain image comes to mind. A classroom with students seated in desks, perhaps in rows facing forward, holding a writing instrument of some kind, notebooks open, listening to the teacher, perhaps copying down notes. And while there are elements of that image that remain true, the pace of technological change hitting many American classrooms today might surprise you. In many classrooms across the country, it would not be surprising to see students cracking open a laptop or a Chromebook more often than they crack open a notebook or hold a pen. Students regularly conduct online research from their seat, scouring the seemingly unlimited volumes of data online that dwarf the libraries of our youth. Over the last decade, American schools have invested tens of billions of dollars in technology upgrades. From high-speed internet infrastructure to acquisition of devices to securing software and licenses for digital content, the race to take advantage of a rapidly developing education technology sector has been swift. It is estimated that public schools in America now provide a computer for 1 in 5 students, and that number is steadily progressing towards a 1-to-1 ratio. Schools spend nearly $8 billion annually on hardware and software, including investments like laptop computers, tablets, maintenance on devices, and core software like Microsoft Office, testing and grading programs. Schools also spend $3 billion per year on so-called digital content for things like ebooks and blended learning software that supports personalized instruction. This rapid growth of technology in the classroom has brought with it a swift evolution, for early adopters at least, of what learning looks like in school. Technology brings with it the power to do things with students not previously possible. For example, software can now assess a student's reading skills and give them a text at their specific reading level. As the student grows, they can receive progressively more challenging texts to push their learning as soon as they're ready for a new challenge. Students who are ready to work ahead of the pace of their peers no longer need to sit and doodle. They can access content prepared by the teacher at their own pace through online learning management systems. Computers, tablets, and even phones facilitate students having access to the vast banks of human knowledge available online for research on any topic imaginable. And in more recent years, students can easily become producers of media with affordable or even freely available software accessible on your average laptop or iPad. And while the impact of this tectonic shift in both the availability and sophistication of technology in classrooms has been significant, there remain many questions and even concerns about the influx of technology in schools. There is a growing body of research showing the connection between screen time and the rising rates of social isolation, depression, ADHD, and other negative mental health outcomes for children. Some teachers and college faculty complain that technology causes students to be distracted and is undermining students' ability to focus on learning. Parents and educators alike have struggled to effectively guide young people in navigating a seemingly unregulated online world, where everything from hate speech to pornography can be accessed, even unintentionally, at the click of a button. And that's before we even begin to think about the dollars and cents of it all. EdTech is considered by venture capitalists to be a lucrative growth market, with major corporations in the testing industrial complex setting explicit goals to get their products into the hands of every student in America, and every school budget along with them.
So with all of that in mind, what should the role of technology be in education? Are we just at the precipice of a great technologically advanced future for school? Or are we at the ledge of a dangerous point of no return? To explore these important questions about teaching and learning in the age of technology, we are joined by 3 special guests today who bring a range of expertise to the table. Furthest from my left is Evelyn Ennis. Welcome, Evelyn.
Hello.
Evelyn is a 6th grade teacher at George Washington Carver Middle School in South Los Angeles. She teaches math and science and is a department chair. She also is currently implementing the new next generation science standards with Amplify, using iPads in her classroom, and also is teaching math with the iReady program as well. Next to Evelyn, we have Jeff Scher. Jeff is a faculty advisor in the teacher education program at UCLA. Jeff's work specializes in critical media literacy, helping to assess and understand issues of racism and sexism through media. Jeff also has a background as an elementary school teacher here in Los Angeles. And to my immediate right is Santos Balasubrahmanyam. Santos is a technologist who specializes in applications and their applicability to education and to health. He was formerly a product manager for Khan Academy and for Google as well, and is currently supporting John Muir High School here where we are filming. So welcome all. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So to kick us off, I kind of want to revisit the question we began the segment with, which is we've had this swift evolution in education and a massive influx of technology. And is this a good thing? Is this a dangerous thing? Are we on the edge of greatness or are we on the edge of peril? What do you think? And maybe we'll start with Evelyn.
Well, I have a classroom with 36 kids in it. When I think of teaching all of my kids, I think technology is an amazing thing because I have students that are as low as second grade that can go as high as seventh grade. And when I think of all of the different levels I have, technology definitely helps me get all my kids to where they need to be.
And what about Jeff and Santosh? What do you think?
I agree. I think there's a lot of potential that technology offers, and your example, I think, is a wonderful example of that. I think we do need to be careful where these tools are things that the students are using as opposed to the students being used by the tools.
Can you say a little bit more about what you mean by that, Jeff?
Well, there are a lot of programs that have the students just do what the program allows them to do, and so the range of choices are not great, and it's not really teaching the kids how to be the creators and the controllers of the information. It's teaching them more how to be the consumers of it. And I think we need to be very careful that these tools don't turn education into more of this kind of banking model where kids are just being standardized into just kind of better robots. And we have the possibility, I mean, these new tools, even cell phones, have the ability to film, to record, to go out and create investigations, to share information, to do so much more, that our students should be empowered to do that with the technology rather than just kind of getting better at test taking.
Whenever I think about this question, I try to step away from the sort of the abstract word technology and get more concrete. So I think the problem with talking about, is technology useful in the classroom in general, is that one, it sort of makes it harder to talk about sort of the reality of what students and teachers are doing on a day-to-day basis, just because it's so abstract. And two, I think it causes us to think that technology is potentially newer in the classroom than it maybe is. For decades we've had graphing calculators, we've had overhead projectors. Many teachers have their own personal computer that they use to facilitate grading and lesson planning and other things. So I think it really depends on sort of the specifics of the activity or the tool that you're using. And like Jeff was mentioning, like some tools can be used well or they can be used poorly, and it all sort of depends on the specifics of how the teacher and the student are deciding to take advantage of the technology.
So in the classic American old school view of classrooms, we're picturing students in desks cracking open a textbook, writing down notes, listening to the teacher talk. What has been the largest impact that technology, digital technology nowadays, has had on that classic model of sitting down and writing down notes and listening to the teacher and reading a textbook?
I think it's the novelty. A lot of the kids, they're just so into it because this is technology they're using. It doesn't matter if I have them type up a paper, as long as it's on an iPad, they're a lot more engaged than if I were to ask them to take out a sheet of paper with a pen.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential once you bring in the technology, because like Evelyn said, it can be much more engaging and motivating for the students, but it is often also being used as just another way of taking tests. And I think one of the big reasons it was funded so much in LAUSD was because the new standardized testing programs needed to be done on an iPad, and so that's where the money came from. And too often that money is just for the hardware, is not for the training of the teachers and helping them think about creative ways they can use the technology.
I think in teachers that I've spoken with, one of the greatest sort of advantages of having the technology in the classroom is just giving them an opportunity to sort of reevaluate. Lots of teachers have sort of built up practices that have worked over time, and the introduction of some new element into the classroom, whether it's iPads or Chromebooks, or just like a new piece of educational software, allows them to reevaluate sort of what's working, what's not working, where can I maybe just save time for myself as a teacher to focus more time elsewhere, where can I give students the opportunity to maybe take more control of their own learning and drive more of that themselves. So I think the real advantage is just sort of the sorts of questions that we're encouraging people to ask as part of technology's increasing rollout in classrooms.
Yeah, I think as I hear you talk, it really makes me think about the things that technology allows a teacher to do that are sort of mechanically not possible without computing involved, right? To be able to personalize experience for students, to be able to enable students to produce, digital content, are things that would have taken, gigantic budgets or huge amounts of time to do in the past. That now can be done, multiple times in a single class period. Jeff, I know you specialize in supporting teachers with kind of using and producing media in the classroom. I wonder if maybe you can speak a little bit from a teacher education standpoint about what you've seen the impact of technology in the classroom be on kind of training the new generation of teachers.
I think there's tremendous potential that these new tools really can do so much, but we really fall short in our training. And what we're seeing is kind of the same thing that happened years ago when Apple put one computer in every classroom. A lot of the tools are not being used, or if they're being used, they're not being used well. We really need to do more about training teachers and helping them think outside the box of how can we change education. Because a lot of people look at technology as this panacea that's just going to make it all, everything better, solve all our problems. And really what's tending to happen is that the technology is being used as just a newer, better instrument to do the same thing that we've been doing for years and years that hasn't been working. So I think we really need to think differently and more critically about these tools, because especially now as the technology becomes so common in society where just about every child walks into the classroom with a cell phone already in their pocket, which is this incredible computer, they have more skills in terms of how to use it, but not how to think about it and how to really use these tools to improve society and to create the notion of democracy that John Dewey talked about education for years. That's what it should be, the goal, and not simply raising test scores.
Evelyn, I'm wondering if maybe you can speak to that as a practitioner and as someone who maybe grapples with the realities of all the pressures around academic outcomes for kids that are real, but also the passion and the desire to have great learning experiences for kids. What role has the kind of introduction of iPads and a blended learning software had in your classroom?
Well, right now, I've been teaching my students to be aware of the areas that they have gaps in. And so with them being aware of their gaps, they're able to come to me and say, hey, Ms. Ennis, I'm using this program right now. I need you to program these set of lessons on there because I know I'm really lacking in these standards. And so for me, it helps me kind of, while I'm moving forward, giving them the tools to kind of fill in the gaps. Because unfortunately, I can't keep going back. My goal is to continue to push them forward. So with technology, as in iReady or MobyMax or whatever program I'm using at the time, I'm able to just say, okay, let me crack open my laptop, let me assign this lesson to this student, and they're able to accomplish those goals, something I was not able to do without the use of technology.
Yeah. And I'm wondering, Santos, from your perspective as someone who has been a part of the process of building, creating, and rolling out Khan Academy, which is certainly one of the more widely used blended learning platforms in America today. what have you seen in terms of maybe changes in impact to the way that students are engaging with content and or teachers are using tools that are available?
Yeah, so I guess the sort of thing that I always keep in the back of my head when I'm thinking about sort of like how to improve a piece of educational technology is in the 80s, Benjamin Bloom, who's famous for Bloom's taxonomy, did sort of a meta-analysis of a bunch of different interventions that you could do in the classroom. So looking at homework, looking at sort of warm-ups at the beginning of a lesson, looking at one-on-one tutoring, looking at all sorts of different ways of structuring the curriculum. And what he found was that far and away the most powerful intervention that you could do is just having one-to-one tutorial instruction, which kind of makes sense. If you have a student who's able to work one-on-one with a teacher, you're going to be able to achieve things that you wouldn't be able to in a large classroom. But obviously, just pragmatically, it's just that's not feasible. And so the way that I think about technology is sort of like, how can we allow teachers to bring their classroom maybe 10% closer to that ideal of one-on-one instruction? And so with that in mind, I think that sort of helps me conceptualize it, but I think sort of as you think about teacher training and helping teachers use these tools more effectively, it's important to have the conversation sort of at the right level of abstraction, right? Like if you talk purely in sort of the abstract pedagogy, that's not really helpful to most teachers as they're thinking about day-to-day lesson planning. And similarly, like in lots of, trainings that happen with educational software, the focus will be on, if you click these 5 buttons in this app, you get magic with your students or something like that. And I think that's too low level. The pedagogy is often too high level. And so I think as you're talking to teachers and students about how to use these tools effectively, you need to kind of strike that middle ground and help people use both the general principles and the concrete specifics of how do I actually use this tool.
Yeah.
So what are the long-term implications of districts moving more and more towards technology in the classroom and towards a 1-to-1 ratio between students and Chromebooks or tablets or any other technology in a profession where funding has long been a challenge and time has long been a challenge in terms of the time teachers need to adequately plan and assess students' learning and all of that. So what are the long-term implications of this move towards technology in the classroom?
I think there's a lot of wonderful potential, but we also have to really keep our eyes open because there's also a lot of potential for corporations and the business world to kind of move in and co-opt this, because it's very easy for them once we start to think that it's all about the tools. Well, then they can create the tools, they can sell the tools, and they can take over public education.
Yeah, I guess when I think about sort of how to deal with this problem of limited time and limited money, I think one of the biggest areas where I think there has been a lot of improvement, but I think where we can still focus more of our collective energy is on just finding ways to save both students and teachers time, so that if you can sort of streamline some of the sort of the more painful day-to-day logistics, you can free up time to think at sort of the higher levels of abstraction about how you want to design your curriculum and design your classroom. And so I think there's still a lot that can be done in just focusing on using technology as purely a way to save time rather than focusing on learning outcomes necessarily. You can focus on saving people time as a proxy for allowing them to spend more of their energy on learning outcomes.
Well, and I've seen that just buying technology and putting them into the classrooms doesn't really help. A lot of teachers, a lot of administrators need to be educated on how to use it, what programs they're going to use with it. And that has proven to be really difficult for a lot of teachers, especially, part of the older generation as well. They're just kind of like, well, I've been doing this for years. Why do I have to use, a laptop? Why do my students need to type? Why do they have to research? And so it's been really hard kind of pushing the thinking beyond what they've already been using in the classroom.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up that point. I think there's there's sort of the digital divide historically that's been talked about, right? The gap between the kind of haves and have-nots when it comes to devices. Parallel to that, I think there's also the cultural shift as professionals, right? That these are new tools, a new way of kind of being as an educator. And like any culture shift, there are those who are excited and early adopters, and there are those who feel, infringed upon or potentially even violated in some way. And so, through your lens as a teacher, Evelyn, what have you seen, and what maybe lessons might you be able to share with us about kind of how to successfully navigate the culture change that comes along with introducing more and more technology in the classroom?
Well, personally for me, I've always found it a lot easier, especially since as soon as I finished with my credentialing program, I went straight into my master's, technology-based education. And so when I got into education, I just thought it was the norm. I thought everyone used it. And then when I started piloting programs and going to my peers and saying, hey, let's use this, I didn't realize I was going to be pushed back upon. And then it kind of became more research-based. It had to become more research-based, and it had to be me bringing my data and say, hey, look, this is where my kids were, this is now where they are, and kind of leaving it on the table for those to choose. And unfortunately, at one point, they didn't have the choice anymore, because it was kind of like from the top down saying, you guys have to use this program, get the kids on it. But then they didn't know how to get the kids on it, and they didn't know the best practices on what to do once the kids were on it. So it became really difficult as a whole.
So just to be clear for maybe some of our non-educator audience members, I think you're describing sharing data of student achievement results.
Absolutely.
Using some of the blended learning platforms that you're using, and sort of letting the data speak for why using these tools might be compelling for folks.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So Jeff, I'd like to turn to you for a moment. I spoke a second ago about the sort of digital divide and the haves and have-nots. We've taken many steps forward. We're not there yet in terms of closing that gap, but something that you mentioned to me in a recent conversation was the kind of shift to a participation divide, and the idea that that there's a growing gap between those in education who are using equipment to create content and share ideas, and those who are maybe operating more as recipients of information with devices. I'm wondering if you can share a little more about that issue, just to kind of help us understand it, and also potentially some thoughts about how we might address this new participation divide.
Right. So many people have been talking now about this idea that it's not so much a digital divide as a participation gap, because, and not just in schools, but in society, what people have the tools, the know-how, the skills, the abilities to actually create and manipulate the information and the tools, and who are now becoming just the recipients and consumers of the information. And in a way, what we're seeing is that it's reinforcing a lot of the gaps and injustices in terms of race, class, gender, and a lot of the areas that have for ages been kind of the dividing areas that have kind of subjugated some and empowered others. And with the technology, that tends to be repeating. The kids in the highest, the most expensive private schools get far more access to the tools and to the training about how to use these and how to mod the systems and change them, where a lot of kids in inner city schools in poor areas are being put in front of the screens, and the screens are kind of telling them what to do and keeping them kind of in that passive consumer role. But I think this is a place where there's a potential for teachers, the whole role of the teacher, to really change, as if teachers can embrace the tools in a more open way where they're learning with their own students, because the students come in with a lot of skills that their kids don't have in terms of how to use these phones and iPads, And so teachers can be learning from them. At the same time, teachers can be guiding them. Okay, so I don't know so much about the skills, but I know how to teach, and I know how to think. And what are some of the questions we need to be asking and wondering about, and what are some of the opportunities we can do with these new tools to really transform our own society?
So there's a lot of ethical considerations when it comes to having so much new technology in schools. There's concerns, social emotional concerns regarding cyberbullying and how kids interact via technology. There's some considerations as a classroom teacher, and for, you know, if you're a math teacher and you give out a test and one kid in the room takes a picture of it and sends it out to their friends, like your next class, when they walk in, they all already know the answers. So when it comes to using technology responsibly, how do we teach students to do that?
Well, I know last school year, I actually had the privilege of teaching Intro to Computers. And one of the many lessons that I did teach was digital citizenship. And online, they actually have this entire program about what's appropriate and what's not appropriate from A to Z. And that was definitely something that we incorporated weekly into our lessons.
Yeah, the notion of digital citizenship is huge, and it's a new class that needs to be taught to everybody. And it's something that even as adults, we're starting to try to figure out, how do you know what's real and what isn't? The whole, you know, obsession right now with fake news, the trolling, the way tweets and other social media can be so devastating when it's not used responsibly. These are skills and things students need to be looking at and questioning and learning about.
But you know, a lot of times they don't realize that some of the things that they're doing are inappropriate until someone comes and tells them, hey, that is inappropriate.
Right, to build on that, I think it's really important to make sure we sort of lift up models of good behavior and good usage, and point out models of like, potentially harmful and destructive usage. Because only by having a collective conversation around those like contrasting examples can we sort of build shared norms around, you know, how to use these devices responsibly.
A lot of kids don't realize whatever they put out online is there forever.
Right.
And that idea of that digital footprint needs to be taught.
Oh yeah.
Right, and just to add on a bit to that, what I've noticed, I've been a classroom teacher for 14 years, and what I've noticed was early on, when I would try to give students lessons on responsible use of the devices, a lot of it was like the just like mechanical aspect of it, like, oh, you send that picture to somebody, it's on their phone, and if their phone, someone gets that phone, whatever, it's there, or record's there. And then Snapchat came around, and now stuff disappears, but it never really quite disappears, and a lot of them don't quite understand what a digital footprint even is. So the focus on, I think I heard mention of norms and citizenship, and just the overall right and wrong, regardless of what the technology is allowing you to do. Just the question of, is it right that you do that? And, just helping students explore that and become aware of that, I think is really critically important. So I would like personally to see more of that embedded into teacher training and how to do that with a set of students that think they know the technology better than you do as a teacher. So
right, and they also need to learn how to protect their own privacy, and because surveillance has become a big part of this new world of technology, and everything they do, everything they type on Google is just a search, or Facebook, Amazon, all of that's recorded. People are collecting it, and then they're selling it, and we don't know where it's going.
Yeah, I want to dig a little bit deeper into this issue. I think we've surfaced some of the sort of good behavior versus bad behavior aspects of the question, but I also think about, we live in this amazing era where any student, or just about any student in America, can access information about just about anything that's ever happened in human history, and the stuff that we've written about so far that might happen in the future. They can access all of it at once, right? And that's just an incredible place to be, and yet that places such incredible importance upon students being able to discern between reasonable information and unreasonable information, or sound arguments and weak arguments, or sources that are trustworthy and sources that are not trustworthy. And certainly we have grown adults and elected officials who struggle with that distinction themselves in this day and age, let alone sixth graders in South Los Angeles. So I'd love to hear from each of you about kind of that aspect of, the downside of having access to all the information is that we have access to all the information, and some of it's pretty bad. How do we help kids, and how do we help teachers help students navigate this terrain?
I think this is one case where the phenomenon with the technology isn't necessarily new. It's just sort of resurfacing in a new way an old problem, right? You can think back to like the origins of yellow journalism in the late 1800s, of like the problem of having like purportedly reputable sources for information that actually shouldn't be trusted, and it's a legitimately hard problem for people who spend their lives focused on like finding truth to sort of sift through the weeds. And I think part of the thing that we can do to help students and teachers is to reinforce the idea that it's not sort of an individual struggle, it's a collective struggle, and that everyone has to sort of help each other parse through everything, because if any one person tries to go at it alone, they're setting themselves up for failure. And I think it's important to reinforce the idea that like you get to the heart of the matter or the truth by talking through issues with your peers, your parents, your friends, your teachers, and other people in the community. And that's how you sort of build this common understanding.
And I think we need a whole new look at teaching skepticism and critical thinking, because it's time, like this has been going on forever with information, but it's time that people are really taught more about how information is always biased, that there's no possible way as humans we can tell and present information objectively, because through our own subjectivities, biases happen. And so bias in itself isn't bad, but bias can be very bad. So we need to empower students to be able to question and ask, what is the bias in this? What's missing? What's being told? How is it being told? And so a lot more deeper questions, and that's really what we try to do with critical media literacy. Because even things like algorithms and numbers have bias.
Absolutely. Kind of going off of what Jeff just said, a lot of things that we do is teach children to be able to identify who the authors of this information is. And so I remember them doing research on Martin Luther King Jr. before, and they stumbled upon a webpage that actually the author was a white supremacist. So it looked authentic and it looked correct to the naked eye, well, to a sixth grader's eye,
right.
And a lot of the information of it was incorrect. And so we had to kind of dig deeper and show them, well, how do you find who actually sponsored this website? And we had to go from there, and that alone was difficult for me as a teacher, and I had to relay that information to my students.
Yeah, I can only imagine the challenges of a young child today and trying to figure out what's true and what's not
Yes.
true. We had to look at the World Book Encyclopedia, and that was about as complex as it got. So I think our final question today maybe is building upon some of the stuff we were just talking about, but it's really looking at kind of the issues of social justice that undergird the discussion we're having today. And curious to hear from you all what your thoughts are about what justice looks like in a world where technology is now such a large and growing part of teaching and learning and the experience of going to school in an era where education is more important than perhaps ever before.
So I think one of the exciting pieces that I find with new technology is the idea of voice, of whose voices can be heard, where the new tools by themselves are not going to do that. There's still going to be the same dominant corporate influence to control them, but there's a new possibility where kids can be taking these tools and teachers can be guiding them to really be able to share their own voices and find other voices that are not typically heard or are being silenced in many ways. So I think voice is a wonderful area.
Well, personally, I've seen it in positive ways, but far too many times I've seen it in such a negative way where, we're talking about justice as adults, but then we're also talking about student justice to their peers. And I find it very dangerous for them when they're posting, when they're looking up information, when they're sharing information. It's just really dangerous.
Yeah, I guess the thing that I focus on is, there are lots of sort of visible and invisible systems that sort of govern, how we interact with one another and how we even, approach the questions of, like, what should we be learning in school? What's the best way to teach those things in school? And so I think as technology continues to be spread more throughout the education system, I think it's important to to make sure that, to the point of voice, that everyone has an equal voice in shaping that system that like sort of sets the rules by which everyone else is playing.
Yeah, as technology continues to rapidly advance, I think this is a discussion that's going to continue to evolve over time, for sure. We definitely thank you each for being part of our panel and sharing a little bit about your work and your perspective relative to technology in the classroom. And for those of you watching, we do have some one-on-one interviews with some of our panelists to learn more about their work and dig a little deeper into how their work impacts our classrooms today. So head over to our website for that, aotashow.com. And once again, I just want to thank everybody for being part.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Wow, what a great seminar discussion today. So many interesting issues about technology in classrooms and the changing landscape of education that we got to unpack with our experts. Just a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. I was hoping we'd be able to ask them about the pending robotic apocalypse as technology takes over the world. We didn't get to that yet.
Next episode, week. Tune in next week, folks.
There we go.
Yeah. All right, next up we turn to a segment we call the assessment. Manuel, what do you got for us?
All right, so check it. I'm at the Hollywood Bowl, right, for a Chance the Rapper concert. The Hollywood Bowl is a legendary outdoor concert venue that seats over 17,000 people, and this was a sold-out show. I'm in my seat waiting for the show to start, and this grown man comes passing by looking for his seat, which happened to be the seat right next to me. Tell me why this grown man was a former student of mine. Here we were, 11 years and 600 miles removed from where we last interacted, and he was seated right next to me in the sold-out 17,000 seat arena. What are the odds? Us classroom teachers love running into former students and seeing them all big and confident and flourishing. For me, moments like this, seeing my students all super grown and awesome, serve as a constant reminder that beneath the standards, tests, and grading, these are humans we're dealing with. Actual, factual little people, not just names in a grade book. They're not frozen in time in that school year. They go on to grow and become adults. And while they're our students, these actual, factual little people need us in more ways than one. Classroom teachers are also de facto counselors and mentors with a dash of social worker and life coach mixed in. Or in other words, we help them connect the complicated dots of this disconnected world. In doing so, we help contribute to the type of adult that they become. This is one of the reasons why forging healthy connections with each and every student is so important. It's a sacred duty, and there are telltale signs when that connection is totally missing. There was that teacher in Alabama last month who told a student playing Tupac's Dear Mama to, quote, turn the nigger tunes off. Then there's that teacher in Pico Rivera who lambasted one of his students for expressing a desire to enlist in the military, calling our soldiers the, quote, lowest of the low. There was also that teacher in Austin who told a student of hers to, quote, go back to Mexico for speaking Spanish in class. Clearly, these individuals are not like the rest of us teachers. These folks do not have a connection with their students. If they did, none of these terrible things would have been said, because teachers who see the humanity in their students and see that they are actual factual people would never do such harm and say these hateful things. We're here to help our students connect dots and grow into awesome human beings, and we must remember that. It's not just test scores and grade books. Last year, I learned of a rapper by the name of Lil Peep. I wasn't familiar with his music, but as soon as I heard his name, saw his picture, and played a song of his, I knew this dude just wasn't my cup of tea. But last December, he died. And one of my students was truly, truly devastated. Lil Peep wasn't anyone to me, but you know what? He was someone to my student. And I was careful to not be dismissive of this artist or tell any of my students to turn his music off. That's because I'm here to help these actual, factual little people become awesome adults. I'm not here to judge or to impart my worldviews onto them, but that's what those 3 teachers did. Nigger tunes, lowest of the low, go back to Mexico. Those teachers judged, and in the worst of ways. Let's be better than them. Let's be that positive connection. Let's remember that these little actual, factual people grow up to be real-world humans. Who they become is influenced by our work in helping them connect in this disconnected world. So be that connection. Take some time to listen and observe. It's pretty easy to do, actually. And if you're lucky, you might one day be seated next to that human, all grown up and confident, and you'll be able to have a great time over great memories. That student of mine, by the way, happens to now be an elementary teacher. So shout out Mr. Goodman, who now has his own actual, factual little people who he is connecting with. And that's my assessment for today.
Wow, Manuel, just beautifully said. I think, oftentimes the human aspect of the value of our profession is perhaps overlooked as we're focusing on achievement and outcomes for kids, which, of course are important. But anyone who's been a teacher or even maybe a mentor or worked in a summer camp context really can relate to that, I think, and understands that relationships are the core currency of the work that we do, and everything else in school is built upon that.
Right.
And we are just about at the end of our show today, and what a show it's been. We have talked about technology in the classroom, we've talked about relationships in schools, so many things, and of course, all of the above. Folks, please make sure you check out our website. That's aotashow.com. You can always find more information about the show, full episodes, extras, segments, anything you need is there. Also, make sure if you're watching on Facebook that you follow us and like us. Same thing on YouTube. And of course, subscribe to our podcasts on SoundCloud, iTunes, and Stitcher. To close out the show, we head to a segment that we call The Dismissal. Manuel, what do you got for us?
All right, so I want to shout out Bronx teacher Melissa Salguero of PS48, who received the 2018 Grammy Music Educator Award. This band teacher has helped revive a robust music program in this under-resourced community. Her 5th grade student Luis said about her, it's, quote, not every day you get to meet a person that is so important in your life and that will teach you a bunch of things about life and stuff, unquote. That's right, Luis. Miss Salguero has that connection with her students, and it sounds like that Grammy Award was well-deserved, so shout out.
All right, great story. Today, my shout out goes to the amazing educators at Florence Griffith Joyner Elementary School in Watts. The school, which is an arts integration school, is just really a place where teachers are doing some amazing work in one of the highest need communities in Los Angeles, building an environment where students are loved and cared for. I was there recently and saw this image. Now, it stood out to me as a powerful contrast to the images we have in our history of water fountains as symbols of bigotry and segregation, like this one. What a powerful flipping of that history on its head. I want to give a special shout out to Principal Melanie Edmond and her entire team of wonderful educators helping to make Florence Griffith Joyner Elementary School a fantastic place for kids in Watts.
Absolutely. Very awesome. Very awesome. Thank you all for tuning in, and remember to go to our website, aotashow.com.